In the peaceful village of Elmwood, where everyone knew each other and life moved at a slow, steady pace, a shocking event disrupted the calm. One morning, the body of Mr. Thomas Harper, a well-respected farmer, was found lying near the old oak tree at the edge of the forest. The villagers were horrified. Murder was unheard of in Elmwood, and the news spread like wildfire. Detective Samuel Lane, a retired investigator who had moved to the village for a quiet life, was called upon to solve the case. Though he had left his detective days behind, the villagers trusted him more than the inexperienced local constable. Reluctantly, Samuel agreed to help. The victim, Thomas Harper, was a kind man who had no known enemies. He was found with a single blow to the back of his head, and his pockets were empty. The only clue was a small torn piece of fabric clutched in his hand, a deep red thread that seemed out of place in the simple village. Samuel began his investigation by interviewing the villagers. He started with Mrs. Harper, the victim's wife. She was distraught, but revealed that Thomas had been acting strangely in the days leading up to his death. He had mentioned receiving a mysterious letter, but refused to share its contents. Samuel also learned that Thomas had been seen arguing with Mr. George Miller, the village blacksmith, a few days before the murder. Next, Samuel visited George Miller. The blacksmith was a burly man with a rough demeanor. He admitted to the argument, but claimed it was over a trivial matter, a missing tool that George believed Thomas had borrowed. George had an alibi for the night of the murder, as he was seen drinking at the village tavern until late. As Samuel dug deeper, he discovered that Thomas had recently sold a piece of land to a wealthy outsider, Mr. Edward Clark, who had plans to build a factory on the site. Many villagers were unhappy about this, as it threatened their way of life. Samuel wondered if Thomas's decision had made him a target. The torn red fabric found in Thomas's hand led Samuel to the village tailor, Mrs. Eliza Brown. She recognized the fabric as part of a scarf she had made for Mr. Clark's wife. Samuel's suspicions grew. He visited the Clark estate, a grand house on the outskirts of the village. Mr. Clark was polite, but evasive, and his wife seemed nervous. Samuel noticed a scarf hanging by the door, identical to the fabric in Thomas's hand, but intact. That night, Samuel revisited the crime scene. Under the moonlight, he noticed something glinting near the oak tree. It was a button engraved with the initials E. C. Edward Clark. Samuel realized that Clark must have been at the scene that night. But why would a wealthy man like Clark kill a simple farmer? The next morning, Samuel confronted Clark at his estate. Clark denied any involvement, but his wife broke down in tears and confessed. She revealed that Thomas had discovered a secret about Clark. He had been embezzling money from his business. Thomas had threatened to expose him unless Clark cancelled the factory project. In a fit of rage, Clark had killed Thomas to protect his reputation. With the evidence and the confession, Clark was arrested, and the village breathed a sigh of relief. Samuel Lane, though saddened by the tragedy, was glad to have brought justice to Thomas Harper. The village of Elmwood returned to its peaceful ways, but the memory of the village victim lingered, a reminder that even in the quietest places, darkness could lurk.